Gary. This good? I've always wanted one of these. It's an Emmy. Our speaker this morning has 5 of them. Isn't that incredible? And he's been a member and been studying Edgar Cayce for decades. He's been at almost every Congress I've been to. I see him in the audience, and they've always had a very low profile here amongst the A.R.E. But what a talent! What a very special talent we have today on speaking on a really fascinating subject. And we can look forward to more of his work because we have a Venture Inward article that he's written that's coming up on the Founding Fathers. So this is a really, I'm just so pleased that Chris has agreed to come and speak with us this morning. He started out his career as an attorney, as a prosecutor. Whoa. In New Jersey, became an attorney, eventually found his way down to Virginia Beach, where he worked for Pat Robertson. Ooh, CBN, and he was on-air talent. And I'm sure he'll tell us how he went from there to here and back and forth. But boy, what a juggling act. He's had a radio show. Which is one of the places I met him, and what incredible guests on his radio show, which was broadcasting right around the corner from here. At, Marianne Williamson, Deepak Chopra, Matthew Fox, Mitch Horowitz, right here, who's written. Most recently, he and his partner, producing partner, Valerie. Please, Valerie, stand up. Come on, just give a wave out. She has 5 Emmys herself too. So I mean, what a power partnership. And they produce a show called American Law Journal, which is shot out of Philadelphia, which covers all kinds of intensely crazy subjects having to do with everything from immigration to pharmaceutical litigation. Very interesting. And they're soon, hopefully, to go national with PBS, and we can all see their shows right across the country. But Christopher, please come. I won't take any more time here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Whatever I paid Sydney to introduce me clearly wasn't enough. I'll tell you that. Well, I want to thank a number of people today. Kevin Tedeschi, the folks here at A.R.E. I had a lovely conversation with Leslie Casey. And the last time I was up here on the stage was 19 years ago. It was right before we rolled out the New World Radio program on WHRV 89.5 here. And it was interesting because A.R.E. was going through a bit of a transition at that time. There were people within the organization that wanted to bring Jesus Christ back into the mission statement. So some people felt like it was being pushed too much in a Christic direction. So when I got up to talk there, to talk about this radio program I wanted to do, that I had a background with both A.R.E. and CBN, people were doing this, now we're done for, we're lost. It's interesting because since that's the last time I was up here, this is kind of a segue. So if you would indulge me for a moment, some of this is personal. You'll see how it dovetails into the bigger picture, but let's start at the very beginning. Meet Frank and Marion. Now, Frank and Marion were very proud of their son back in 1983. I had just graduated law school. I had passed the New Jersey bar exam. They thought I was on the fast track to being a litigator at a New Jersey law firm. Heck, I even was promoted or signed up as an assistant prosecutor, as Sydney just said a moment ago. Check out the 3-piece suit and the very earnest look on my face. So Frank and Marion, again, were very happy, but there were 2 things standing in the way of this grand future for their son. One was my love of broadcasting, and the other one was my now ever-expanding spiritual journey. And so I was thinking about moving to Virginia Beach. Well, you can imagine how much that pleased Frank and Marion. They said, "A Bible school? Really? And who is this Edgar Cayce fella?" So one day I'm visiting them right before I make my move to Virginia Beach. And I'm upstairs in one of their spare bedrooms, and I'm sitting in my half lotus position in silent contemplation. I hear my mom come up the stairs, and then I hear her run back down again. And at the foot of the stairs, I hear her saying, "Frank, Frank, he's meditating." And without skipping a beat, my dad says, "Don't worry, Marion, he's a lawyer." As if some attainment of professional status would wipe away any stain of religious quackery their 27-year-old son had been engaged in. So, and Frank and Marion will come back into this conversation a little bit later. So a day after my 28th birthday, I head on down to Virginia Beach. And my first day, or actually my second day down here, I'm looking out a classroom window, but it's not the sand and the ocean, it's the trees and the farmlands on the west side of town. I am now matriculating at CBNU University, the Christian Broadcasting Network University. I'm going for my graduate degree in broadcast journalism. Now, at this time, I was quite clear that there was already somewhat of a divide between A.R.E. and CBN. But the first day, the very first day, myself and about 30 other students who are matriculating are seated, and the president of the university gets up there. And he starts telling us about the experience we're going to have and how you're dedicating your career to God, etc. And then he launches into this. The reason that Pat Robertson, founder of this CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network, host of the 700 Club, the reason he founded this place was to counterbalance the darkness on the other side of town. And in my mind, I'm going, here we go. I mean, again, I knew this was going to come up at some point in time, but the very first day, and for about 3 to 5 minutes, this minister, or actually this president of the university, is kind of launching into it. Well, you know, I had to think to myself, why here? Why were these two organizations in the same place? I mean, you have the most noted psychic of all time in American history right here in Virginia Beach. You have the most prominent Christian organization in the entire nation, maybe the world, in Virginia Beach. Why are these two places? I mean, if it was New York or LA or San Francisco or Chicago, you figure, well, there's two of anything in those cities, right? I mean, this was Virginia Beach, Virginia. So years after, as Sydney was mentioning, I conducted a radio show on 89.5 and on 850 WTAR here locally. And because it was important to me, one of the first questions out of my mouth to Carolyn Mace or Deepak Chopra, whomever, is, why do you think these two entities are here in this same place? Is it mere coincidence? Something about Virginia Beach? Some interrelated destiny? Maybe one group is supposed to learn from the denied self, the shadow of the other? What is behind this? And as our notions of spirituality and God evolve, what would each organization do, and how might they influence and interrelate to each other, and what would they do to influence the consciousness of the nation? Well, I don't know if I have any answers today. Newsflash. I do have some theories, and along the way, at least I'll be telling some interesting stories. So, in this place, Virginia Beach, let's rewind just a couple of years, if you don't mind. Let's go back to, thank you, Valerie. All the pictures, Valerie, they're all hers. Animals are a big theme in her work. So let me rewind just a couple of years before I actually came here to Virginia Beach. I take 1 year between college and law school, and the reason that the cat's reading a book is because I go to my Mountainside, New Jersey library one day. Again, this is a year between college and law school, so I'm taking the year off, if you will. but I was going to get an education that year, and boy, did I ever. I go to my Mountainside, New Jersey library, and I'm just thumbing through the shelves, and I find this book. I was like, I know this guy, don't I? I've heard of this guy. He's the ventriloquist, yeah. That's it. I was thinking of Edgar Bergen, right? Of course, only years later I got the metaphor, that Edgar was channeling through Charlie McCarthy, and Soros was channeling through Edgar. So I read that book that day all the way through, The Sleeping Prophet, and of course, I was just captivated. I sat there in the library, and the only frame of reference I had up to that point in time was this book. Some of you may remember The Late Great Planet Earth. One of the biggest nonfiction seller in the 1970s. And so this was kind of the Christic balance, if you will, to Edgar Cayce, because he talked about, Hal Lindsey talked about prophecy as well. I had a chance to interview him sometime in life too. So after that year of taking the year off, and a lot of well-meaning people in my life said, well, you don't know if you want to go into broadcasting or law. Why don't you go to law school? You'll never regret it. You'll never go back to communication school. Well, as it turns out, I went out to the University of Dayton, and I got into law schools in New Jersey, but I chose Dayton, and that's actually a little bit of a part of this story too. So while I'm in Dayton, Ohio, despite the fact that I had to work hard as a first-year law student, I had some time to watch TV. And my spiritual life is still burgeoning, if you will. And one night I'm watching TV, and I see this guy on TV, and he's talking about God, he's talking about spirit, but he's not in a pulpit. He's actually like at a desk like Johnny Carson. Not cool. We couldn't, Val and I tried to find one, we couldn't. This is as close as we came. But this guy is interviewing people in a Johnny Carson-like setting, and I was fascinated. Wow, he's talking about God and spirit and all these great things. And it was Pat Robertson. And it was the 700 Club. And it was Virginia Beach, Virginia. And I said to myself, Virginia Beach, Virginia, I wonder if there's some sort of relationship between Edgar Cayce and Pat Robertson. My wild-eyed innocence. Maybe they have some sort of relationship, one to the other. They're both in Virginia Beach. Little did I know. So one day, Pat's on the air, and he's talking about reincarnation. I was like, oh, this is interesting. This should be good. And he said, the Bible doesn't, and I'm not going to do a bad Pat imitation, I promise, Valerie. The Bible does not. The Bible doesn't address reincarnation. It's a Hindu concept. It's a concept of the cults. I would hear that term over my life at CBN as well. And he said, and if you believe in the Edgar Cayce readings, okay, you've got my attention, you might come back as a janitor, or Cleopatra, or a dung beetle. I said, dung beetle? I don't think Mr. Cayce talked about that. But I think it was at that moment that now the demarcation line, if you will, between A.R.E. and CBN was becoming a little bit clearer to me, that there really was indeed a divide. But nevertheless, I was going to be, like Mr. Cayce, would eventually make a trek from Dayton, Ohio to Virginia Beach. I would shortly be doing the same. So, in 1981, I take my first trip to Virginia Beach, and my first stop is to CBN, the 700 Club. First day I walk into Studio 7. It's empty. No one's in there. I'm on a tour. And oh, it took my breath away. It was beautiful. It was opulent. It was powerful. It was kinetic. It was a crackling feeling within my very soul. But as I toured the campus and they took me around, it became very clear that this was kind of a my way or the highway kind of group. Yeah, they were into Jesus, but not a whole lot else. I went across town the very next day, and I went to the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and I went up and I actually took looks at the books upstairs in the library, and for the first time in my life, I'm reading the Edgar Cayce readings from these very books, these archives that Gladys Davis and others had put together, and it talked about the multidimensional nature of our souls. It talked about having experiences in other dimensions. It talked about the mystical root of every great religious tradition, and it took my breath away. But the carpeting was a little worn. There were some things that needed some fixing. They clearly weren't out in the world nearly as much, but the thought did hit me right then and there. What if you could bring the very best of these two worlds together? What would you create? So again, this was in '81. This was a visit. 2 years later, I tell Frank and Marion, I'm out of here. I'm going to Virginia Beach, much to their chagrin. And Sydney's right, but as a student, I land my first job at New Site. Yeah, the polyester suit is real, folks. So is the hair. Now, the funny thing is that I didn't wear a beard before or after that. So people said, well, you obviously went in incognito. You were trying to look like an apostle, that sort of thing. So, you know, in the daytime part, I would go to CBN for classes. In the evening, I'd study the Cayce readings, and my friends heard this a lot, so I apologize if you've heard the story before. But by day, it was praise Jesus, and at night, it was, hey, the vibes are great in here. Well, you know, maybe I was naive, but I really thought, because people say, well, why'd you go there? You could go almost anywhere. I said, well, I really thought that there could be a bridge built between esoteric spirituality and fundamental Christianity. We could kind of build this bridge. The only thing is that at that time, that chasm was getting wider. Why is that? It was the growth of the Christian coalition and the religious right. It was the time of Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Ralph Reed, their Time magazine. And they were aligning themselves politically so that that particular chasm would only get deeper. And of course, their fond relationship with President Ronald Reagan. So I knew that at the very least, even though this chasm was wide, I felt like, well, maybe someday, but not now. I was there to get a great education, and I also was watching the spiritual consciousness of the nation unfold before me, in front of my eyes. Well, one thing I think I may actually share in common with Messrs. Robertson and Cayce is that I too felt that Spirit had led me here, that they both believed that God led them to be here, that this was a sacred place, that they were here to do God's work. In the 19-teens, Edgar Cayce, when he was living in Selma, Alabama, gets a reading about Virginia Beach, that this is the place that maybe he should come to. He gets a reading that a hospital could best be located in a tiny Virginia seaside resort known as Virginia Beach, Virginia. Well, Edgar had never even heard of Virginia Beach. Didn't know where it was on the map. So Gladys Davis, her uncle and his wife, Gladys's uncle and his wife, end up going to Virginia Beach and says, you know, let's check out what the readings have to say. And he goes there, and what do they find? A small little fishing village. And basically they come back and they go, don't even bother. We don't even know what Source is talking about. Now, Cayce moves from Selma, Alabama, and he goes to Dayton. So he still hasn't made that leap to Virginia Beach. But he starts getting more readings about Virginia Beach. And this one in 1924 is, the better place to establish such an institute would be near large bodies of water, preferably on the East Coast at or near Virginia Beach. And of course, it was his great benefactor, Morton Blumenthal, a New York stockbroker, who says, this is the right place, the choice is Virginia, you must go there, I will provide the money. So in 1925, Cayce ups and moves his family from Dayton, Ohio to Virginia Beach, Virginia. Now sadly, and I know anyone involved with the A.R.E. readings over the years, and Cayce readings, we regret the fact that we really don't have Edgar on tape. We have some film of him. I think there's one audio track of Edgar somewhere. But we don't have his words as to why I moved to Virginia Beach. The same can't be said for Mr. Robertson.
You may be familiar with the story of how God led Pat Robertson to Tidewater, Virginia. It was 1959, and Pat sensed he was to buy a rundown TV station.
I came to my mother's home in Lexington, Virginia, and while I was there was a letter from a friend who said there's a TV station in Tidewater. Would Pat be interested in claiming it for the Lord? Went back to New York, spent, I think, a week in fasting. And while I was there, the Lord said to claim the airways from the Prince of the Power of the Air and give them to the Prince of Peace. And so I left there and came down here to Virginia, where the station was, in Portsmouth.
Amazing Answers to Prayer led to the beginning of CBN in 1960 and the 700 Club in '61. Tremendous growth in the ministry meant a need for more space. Choice land became available in Virginia Beach. Even after years of fruitful ministry, one question still lingered in Pat's mind. Why Virginia Beach?
Of course, we all knew about Jamestown. We learned about Jamestown, the first colony, and Captain John Smith and Pocahontas and all that stuff. I mean, that's part of Virginia lore. But I didn't know anything about the spiritual heritage of this place, not at all.
That would change in 1976, 16 years after the move to Tidewater. A CBN magazine editor did some research on a memorial there named Cape Henry, where the first English settlers landed.
And she came across the name of a man named William Hacklock. I'd never heard about him in my entire life. There were 8 of them all together who went to King James and said, we want all the land in this new world from what is now the northern part of South Carolina all the way to the border of Canada, and from Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. And the king gave it to him. The entire, I mean, this enormous amount of land. But he said, I want to take the gospel to these people.
The company's chaplain was the Reverend Robert Hunt.
Hunt was very prophetic. He said that the gospel would be preached not only in this land, but throughout the world, from these shores. A very moving prayer.
I think I can say with great confidence this is the first time Pat Robertson has ever spoken from this stage. Unless you've got a tape somewhere else. What's interesting about this is not what Pat says, but what he doesn't say. So the interesting thing about Pat is that over years he would become a little bit more diplomatic. Early on in the 60s, he really went after anybody who didn't believe in Jesus the way he did. And I'm sure Cayce was part of that, obviously. But by this time in the 2000s, he was really, as I say, much more diplomatic, but he actually spoke a little bit in code. You may have missed it. He said, I claim the airwaves from the prince of the power of the air for the Prince of Peace. What does that mean? Actually comes from Ephesians. And basically, it's the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now at work in the sons of disobedience. Sounds like the sons of Belial, doesn't it? But anyway, Ephesians is where it comes from. And if you really wanted to know what Pat thought about the prince of the power of the air, i.e. Satan, go back to 1972. His book, one of his first ones, Shouted from the Housetops. This is the reason, one of the big reasons he came here. In 1959, the Tidewater area of Virginia was literally a spiritual wasteland. For years, it had been in the grip of demon power. Virginia Beach was advertised as the psychic capital of the world. It was the headquarters of Edgar Cayce and the Association for Research and Enlightenment, A.R.E., where you're seated today. Mediums, clairvoyants, and necromancers. Necromancers? For the uninitiated. Black magic, sorcery. And necromancers flocked to Virginia Beach, saying the vibrations in the air made their work easier. These satanic vibrations, which traverse space and time, are the communication channels to which sensitives or mediums must attune themselves, and Virginia Beach was renowned as the prime receiving station of the universal transmitter, Satan. You can almost hear Dana Carvey in your ears, can't you? Stories abounded of people who discovered their psychic sensitivity while visiting the area. Spiritual centers dotted the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. Well, you know, something really interesting about this, and that is in some ways, he wasn't really that far off in some ways with what Edgar Cayce was saying. There was something about the vibrations here. Now, he looked at it as satanic versus spiritual, or Jesus versus Satan, that sort of thing. But Cayce's readings really talked about the energy of this place. That there was something in the air, there was something energetic, healing, and powerful, that the ocean would be a great conductor here in Virginia Beach for his psychic readings. The sand here in Virginia Beach, if you visited A.R.E. in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, one of the first things you did is you went out to get a sand pack, right? In the ocean front. Don't do it today. That sand's from the Chesapeake Channel. It's been dredged, so. But the sand, at least maybe at the north end, in 89th Street, 90th Street, that sand had gold-flecked qualities, medicinal qualities to it. And we know that stone has vibration, so it was part of the vibratory pattern of this area. And I spoke with Leslie Cayce about this, and she talked about the first time she and CT came together, and she said the energy of this place was, palpable. You could feel it, especially when you went back into Seashore State Park, which is now First Landing State Park, which is right behind this building. If you haven't walked back there, if you don't live back there, take a walk through that park. It's magical to me. Spanish moss grows there. It's the furthest north that Spanish moss grows. The flora and fauna is really highly diverse. The little cedar wood stumps in the swamps remind me of gnomes, or maybe Cayce's little people. There's really something magical about it. But Cayce also conducted a lot of readings about Virginia Beach after he moved here in 1925. And of course, we know it for at least two things. And one is that somehow that this would be a safety land at the time of earth changes, right? The area where the entity now is located, Virginia Beach, will be among the safety lands. But he went beyond that, and this is from reading 1152. He said, "Is Virginia Beach to be safe? It is the center and the only seaport and center of the White Brotherhood." The White Brotherhood. What was Edgar talking about? Stay tuned. When two preeminent spiritual organizations are both occupying the same place, chances are they're going to rub elbows, bump into each other. Maybe worlds will collide. Now, Mr. Cayce obviously never met Mr. Robertson, nor did he hear of him, because Robertson was 15 when Edgar passed away. Of course, we know that Pat often spoke about Mr. Cayce on his program, and we know that in 1961 is when Robertson starts the 700 Club. So by 1965, he's probably taken a shot at Edgar more than once. Now, I had heard that there was a letter that Hugh Lynn had written to Pat Robertson. We could not find that letter, but we know that he wrote to Pat Robertson because Pat wrote back to him. Again, this is in 61, early on. So Pat writes back to him. And I'm not going to go into the details of the letter. We really don't need to go down that path. I'll only say this, is that what he says in this letter is no different than what he had said many times in public, on the air, in writing, in any venue. That Mr. Cayce's source was counterfeit. He was possessed by demons. He may have healed people with his psychic energy, but that was Satan masquerading as light. It's also very interesting that in this letter and elsewhere, every time he puts up a defense, he chooses the Old Testament versus the New Testament 3-1, which is kind of interesting. I'll come back up a little bit later in the talk. But, and it's interesting because a friend of mine who's an A.R.E. member went to see Pat Robertson and the 700 Club right around 1979, 1980. And you got a chance to ask Pat questions if you wanted to. You could write them on a 3x5 card and they would pass it along, and Pat, during break, would look at them and he'd choose the ones he wanted to read and address. So like a good cross-examining attorney, he wrote, "Why are you intolerant of Edgar Cayce?" Well, Pat picks that question. He decides he's going to read it. And he starts saying, "I'm intolerant of Edgar Cayce because he was not a true Christian. I am intolerant of Edgar Cayce because his source is demonic. I am intolerant of Edgar Cayce," on and on and on it went. 5-6 times he started his sentence out by saying, "I am intolerant." Interesting, no? And it was interesting because he basically set the crowd into a place of discomfort. At least this is what my friend said. There was murmuring, they went to break, but something wasn't amiss. I guess after saying I am intolerant a half dozen times, that can happen. Well, there are other stories as well. These are a little bit more lighthearted. Who remembers Peter, Paul, and Mary? Come on. Come on. Good. There are a couple of 40-somethings in the audience, right? Okay. Folk group known best probably for the Dylan song, Blowing in the Wind, Puff the Magic Dragon, which they were adamantly saying was never about drugs, Leaving on a Jet Plane, John Denver's song. And Paul Stuckey, right here, this gentleman right here, wrote the wedding song. If you went to a wedding in the 70s and 80s, you heard it a million times, right? Well, in 1968, Paul Stuckey is going through his own born-again experience. And he's kind of part of the Jesus movement. Now, the Jesus movement in the late 60s, for the uninitiated, was not incorporated yet into big evangelicalism. The Jesus movement was more of a hippie Birkenstock kind of movement. John the Baptist, the dates and the figs, that kind of thing. But Stuckey is involved in this, and a lot of people who are coming to the fore and are starting to discover their spirituality come through this channel as well. 1968, now he's a star at this point. He and a buddy get in the shorts, pack themselves in the van, they go across to Virginia Beach. They actually visit the A.R.E. We go down to Virginia Beach to the Edgar Cayce Institute, check out some of the spiritual options, and like, didn't I even buy a Bible there? And so rearmed, as it were, with some spiritual thoughts of my own. You could get a Bible at A.R.E.? Did anyone tell Pat that? Well, Pat had heard apparently about Paul's born-again experience. In fact, Paul had talked to one of his producers. So he gets invited to the 700 Club. And he's on the air, and back in those days, of course, Pat wasn't really getting A-listers. This is like late 60s, early 70s, right? So he's talking to him, and he's telling him about Jesus and his born-again experience and how he loves the Lord, and he's quoting Bible passages, and Pat's grinning that Pat grin ear to ear, and he's loving it. And he said, well, how do you find our fair city? He goes, oh, I love Virginia Beach. Just yesterday I was at the oceanfront, and I went to the Edgar Cayce Institute and the A.R.E. Now, I saw this. I actually saw this episode. And my color TV back in those days probably wasn't very good. But I swear I saw Pat turn 14 shades of purple. Cut to break, out to break. George Ritchie is a name before we go on to this is very kind of an interesting aside. So on his first solo album and a live album, Paul Stuckey wrote a song called Edgar. Nobody knew what it was about. And someone asked him later, what was that song Edgar about? He goes, oh, it's about the mystic Edgar Cayce. It's not a great song, otherwise I would have played it here today. But check it out online. But yeah, he did write it about Edgar Cayce. George Ritchie is a name and a face that many of you recognize and probably saw here many times over the years. George wrote the book Return from Tomorrow. It's a story about how at the age of 20 in an Army hospital, he actually passes from this life, and he meets the Son of God in this near-death experience. Well, this gets back to Pat Robertson and the 700 Club producers, and they invite him into town to speak. And he's ready to go on the 700 Club. And an intervening moment, a donor says he plays for the other side as well. And at the last minute, George Ritchie is disinvited. There are a number of CT stories, Charles Thomas Casey stories, and CBN. I'm only going to tell two of them. That's the only time. That's all I have time for. CT was traveling out of Norfolk Airport. And if you know Norfolk Airport, their phrase is, Norfolk Airport, make the connection. Because if you fly out of Norfolk, I guarantee you'll be making a connection somewhere. So CT is waiting, and his plane is delayed. And he sees his camera crew come in. One guy's a big burly guy, Harley Davidson kind of guy. And then another demure nurse comes in, and he's just seated there. And the producer, the director, comes up to him and says, sir, we're shooting a commercial here today, and our third person hasn't shown up. Can you help us out? Or maybe they were looking for a professorial accounting type, genial kind of man. He says, well, what are you shooting? He says, we're shooting a new promo for our new Bible called The Book. And he says, are you a student of the Bible? He goes, oh, yes, I read the Bible almost every day. Do you have a spiritual or religious life? Oh, yes, I do. The greatest part of my life is my search for God's study group. So CT is part of the commercial. Now, to this day, I have never seen the commercial, and no one else here has seen it. And who knows, if they knew it was CT, they may have scotched it. But it is kind of interesting. This next story is a little bit more intriguing, and I only learned about this recently. I'd heard something about this, but there was a gentleman here in Virginia Beach known as Walter Lanier. His name looks like Longyear. And he was a direct mail maven, if you will. He owned a business that did direct mail for both CBN and for A.R.E. And in the spirit of geniality and congeniality, he wanted to bring the two together. He thought he'd be like some sort of peacemaker, right? So one day he's got Pat in a car, and he's taking him somewhere. He says, somebody I want you to meet. So he takes him out to CT's farm in Pungo. And he gets in the house, and when Pat Robertson figures out where he is, he says, in no uncertain terms, Walter, get me the hell out of here. But not before CT could say, you know, every time you speak badly of the A.R.E. and my grandfather, our membership goes up. You know, one of the interesting things about Robertson and CBN in my experience is, you know, they always put down psychic phenomena. They always put down demon power. They always talked about this. And yet, while I was there, I saw people engage in glossolalia. Anybody know what glossolalia is? Speaking in tongues, absolutely. And you know, in some ways, when I would hear people speak in tongues, it sounded to me a little bit like channeling. It didn't, I mean, sometimes, I mean, look, let's face it, channels can be fake, and they can be real. I would hear people speak in tongues, and it sounded like it was coming effortlessly through these people. They also were big believers in being slain in the spirit, where a person would he would get touched by a minister or an adept, and you know, maybe had a third eye experience, a Kundalini experience, and he or people behind him would actually, you know, fall down. I'm not exactly sure what was happening there psychologically, spiritually, but those things happened. They believed in laying on of hands. They were followers of prophecy. They were big time into dreams. And this was one that I saw myself too, and he still probably does this today. Pat has his words of knowledge, and words of knowledge can't even be found in the Bible. And he would say something like, there's a man in Terre Haute, Indiana, who's suffering from cancer, and God is healing you right now. Now, I would still put Edgar Cayce's track record up against Pat's as far as medicinal diagnoses, but think about it. In some ways, they were doing medicinal readings, diagnoses from across the miles, and in some weird adjunct way, wasn't Mr. Cayce doing the very same thing? Well, now for the very interesting part of our talk, and maybe just a little bit of controversy as well. Are there recurring themes, reincarnation dramas, archetypal interplay between these organizations and peoples and philosophies? We're going to look at two themes. One, first, the Essenes. And of course, we know that Edgar talked about the Essenes long before it was ever part of our lexicon. In the 1930s and 40s, Cayce talked about this small devoted sect of Jews who were the ascetics, they were the adepts. They were preparing the way for Jesus. They were known as the Way. They were a continuation of the legendary school of prophets of Melchizedek, and they were preparing people to go into a world of secularism and materialism and to bring their best enlightened selves with them. Well, Cayce gave readings on the Essenes 171 times he refers to them. But here's the interesting thing. Cayce dies in early 1945. Later in 1945, in that very same year, there's a treasure trove of Gnostic Gospels that are found in Nag Hammadi. Now, there had been some bits and pieces of some of the Gnostic Gospels that had been found before that day. But at this time now, we're starting to hear about the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. And then, of course, 2 years later, the real treasure trove, the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, 1947. And lo and behold, so many of the things that Edgar Cayce had talked about were backed up by these sacred texts. Cayce talked about the fact that the Essenes were students of what you would call astrology, numerology, phrenology, and those phases of the study of the return of individuals or incarnation. He talked about the fact that they would record experiences of the supernatural, or out of ordinary experiences, whether in dreams, visions, voices, or whatnot. Cayce referred to these folks as members of the Brotherhood or the White Brotherhood because of the white robes that they would wear. So the readings confirmed what a number of Gnostic Gospels had written, that Jesus and John the Baptist were Essenes, and hence members of the White Brotherhood. Now, this is not a term, just so you know, unique specifically to Cayce. Actually, adepts such as Alice Bailey, Madame Blavatsky, and others talk about the Great White Brotherhood, and they refer to them as ascended masters. But Cayce was specifically talking about the Essenes, and when he would give readings to people who came to him in the 30s and 40s, many of them had had past lives as Essenes. Some of them became involved in the A.R.E. Judy Chandler, person number 1472, was said to have headed up a group of Essenes as part of the Temple Beautiful. Jesus' sister Ruth, person number 1158 in the readings, was given a reading by Edgar. She was the heir to the Firestone tire fortune, and she helped underwrite some of Cayce's work. Hugh Lynn Cayce, according to his father's readings, said that he was the Apostle Andrew. Probably a lot for people to take in at that time. But if that's the case, how does that tie into what we're talking about today? Okay, let's just step out on the thin, skinny branches for just a minute, all right? So Essenes, we know exactly what they stood for, again, the more metaphysical, mystical. The Sanhedrin, of course, were the religious leaders of the Holy Land at that time. They were very powerful. They were religiously powerful. They were wealthy. They had the finest robes. They interpreted Scripture, the Torah, literally. They were the fundamentalists of their day. They had a really interesting relationship with Rome. Rome had hegemony over the entire area. But when it came to the religious lives of the people in Judea, it was the Sanhedrin. If you wanted to heal on a Sunday or a day of Sabbath, I should say, as Jesus tried to do, that could land you into some trouble. Now, I don't want anyone walking out of here today saying, Christopher Naughton said that Pat Robertson was Caiaphas and that CBN is the Sanhedrin. But what I would like us to take a look at, because even I look at the Cayce readings sometimes not literally, but I look at them symbolically, I look at them energetically, I look at them archetypally. So I'm just asking us to weigh into this. If reincarnation or archetypes are here to teach us something, and they're holding the energy or in the space, we should probably be mindful of that. And what is it telling us? Well, one thing about reincarnation, one would hope, is that it's another opportunity to heal a rift. It's another opportunity to awaken. And I would just say, if entities in our nation, Sanhedrin, Rome, the Essenes, if there are organizations or groups that are a neat overlay today, if we're seeing a recurring theme here, what are we going to do to heal that rift? This has nothing to do with my talk. Valerie just thought it was getting too intense, so we need some animal light-hearted stuff here. So, adorable, right? He's enjoying his carries. Well, before we leave the White Brotherhood, one last bit here. Cayce, of course, said in his readings that he was Rata in a previous lifetime, and that he was responsible for the building of the pyramid. And the Great Pyramid was not a tomb for pharaohs. It was actually a hall of initiation. And in this reading from 1932, he said it was the building of this that was to be the hall of the initiates, of that sometimes referred to as the White Brotherhood. In the same pyramid did the great initiate, the master, take those last of the brotherhood degrees with John, the forerunner of him, at that place. And speaking of pyramids, is our second recurring theme happening here in front of us. But first, here are a few words from the 700 Club.
America's destiny and purpose were sealed with that cross at Cape Henry. All that would follow in our nation's growth hinged on that single proclamation that this land belonged to Jesus Christ.
America's revolutionary fathers weren't just nominal Christians. They were profoundly influenced by the New World's first revival, the Great Awakening. Reverend Eddie Hyatt tells how it hit from the 1720s to 60s in his book, America's Revival Heritage. Colonial pastor Jonathan Edwards, known to pray and study his Bible 13 hours a day, watched radical revival take over his hometown in Massachusetts.
The way he describes it is just like one day God invaded the town of Northampton.
Then the powerful English preacher George Whitefield brought his fiery sermons to America. Scorned by the established church, he preached salvation to huge multitudes outdoors. Crowds from 10,000 to as many as 30,000 showed up. 60 years after it began, the Great Awakening still influenced the Founding Fathers and continues to benefit our country today.
More than 400 years have passed since America was first conceived at Cape Henry, and respect for our roots is growing cold. Yet one undeniable fact still remains. At its core, the United States of America is a Christian nation.
You know what's interesting is that back when I was at CBN as a student, they didn't have the 4-star hotel and the 4-star restaurant and that sort of thing. But in the ensuing years, they built the Founders Inn. And of course, the implication is quite clear, right? Founders are Christians. Come on. That's why they're here at CBN, right? But I will pass there, and even if no one's in the car, I will say to no one in particular, deist, Freemason, Rosicrucian, Unitarian, that sort of thing. Because what you don't hear, I mean, I would admit this. I would say this. There were two great awakenings in American history, religious awakenings. They were emotional, they were passionate, but that's just part of the story, isn't it? Beneath those great awakenings was the spirituality of the still small voice. You had deists and you had Freemasons who were that quiet, more silent part. Now, yeah, they got involved in the revolution as well, but it had nothing to do with the evangelizing of George Whitefield. So the Masons bring over a rich tradition of esoteric spirituality, going back to the Hermetic tradition in Egypt, all the way through to Europe. Sir Francis Bacon, a Rosicrucian, the father of Freemasonry, is one of Thomas Jefferson's greatest influences. So the spirituality, you don't see any of that mentioned in the CBN clip. Also beneath the second great awakening in the 19th century is the esoteric movement of the American transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, etc. Again, these are movements that kind of move beneath the loud great awakenings, which were part of the tapestry of American history. But those CBN clips don't tell the entire story. Stephen Waldman, who is the founder of BeliefNet, said, the founders were men of unorthodox spirituality. And in my upcoming article on founding mystics, I make the argument that the founders' spiritual vision at its core is much more closely akin to Cayce than to fundamental or evangelical religions. Here's what Cayce had to say about the Masons, right? This is right before the end of the war. How are we going to rebuild this world? He said, and that is expressed and manifested in the brotherhood of man into the group thought as expressed by the Masonic order. Not that the world is to become a Masonic order, but the principles that are embraced in same will be the basis upon which the new order of peace is to be established in 44 and 45. If you say that evangelicalism is not part of American history, you're missing a piece. But if you ignore the deistic roots, Unitarians, Freemasons, Quakers, etc., the inner light, then you're missing an equally important, if not more important, part of the story. Now, if you want to see a difference of opinion, you can go to the CBN website even today, and this is written by Pat Robertson. What are the principal beliefs of mind control, Spiritism, Edgar Cayce, and Hinduism? That's a lot in one basket, huh? In one way or another, each of these cults, there's that word again, focuses on the universal consciousness concept that human beings are part of a vast, timeless consciousness. Okay. Are ultimately divine. Bring it on. Will live forever in various forms. Okay. Got me so far. This next part is a little convoluted. Can communicate with the dead or various spirits in the universe through reincarnation. Okay, maybe out of order there, a little syntax problem. And can receive power through psychic, in some instances, bodily exercise to transcend nature, understand mysteries, and affect their own destinies or the lives of those around them. There's some truth in that as well. My viewpoint. These groups, in the name of research and enlightenment, psychic research, transcendental meditation, yoga, are actually not in touch with the same great God consciousness, are not in touch with some great God consciousness or psychic power, but Satan and demons. Now, you'd say, well, did he write this 30 or 40 years ago? That's still on the website today. So what some of this tells me is that we are in this nation, around the world, but really in this nation, there are two parallel tracks. Let's put our atheist brothers and sisters on the side here for just a moment. But the evolution of spirituality in this nation, the two tracks, one being sin, redemption, Christianity, and the other being divine potential spirituality. So that if you are a member of the sin, redemption, Christianity route, you probably have to be afraid of Satan. Could it be Satan? Yes, it could be. As far as divine potential spirituality, there is a notion growing. We always have to have South Park in our talks. That's just how it goes. Valerie insists on it. So, but part of the story that we hear about Jesus through the Cayce readings and other esoteric readings is that Jesus is our template. He's the way shower. This is what all men can become. This is what all men must become. And Jesus, of course, I heard from good authority, he had a very good year. Here he is talking to his father, and he says basically that even though he's 2,000 years old, I feel like I'm 28 again. So, you know, Pat always likes to talk about the fact that here in Virginia Beach, they are here to bring a revival to the world. That the problem with America, whether it's shootings at our schools, or whether it's a hurricane blowing through Florida, or if it's terrorists from the Mideast careening into our buildings, we don't have revival. And I would only say this: is the nation ready for a different kind of revival? Are we ready for a spiritual, not religious revival? Well, Mom and Dad always said, don't talk religion and politics, but yes, we are going there. Back in 2006, a student at North Carolina University published a paper, wrote it as her senior thesis. She spent an entire year here in Virginia Beach comparing and examining both campuses, CBN and A.R.E. It's really interesting. It's called Losing Faith in the Secular, the Politics of Faith and Knowledge at Two American Parachurches. Her name is Carrie Little Hirsch. And she talked about a lot of things. I can't go into very much here, but she talked about the politics of both organizations. And she said this: CBN is a highly political and almost exclusively conservative Republican organization. A.R.E. is fiercely apolitical. Now again, both of these patterns I had seen up close and personal when I attended church, or when I attended CBN, and when I was part of the A.R.E. back in the 1980s. But I would say in some ways that kind of division, if you will, politically, has actually become more intensified on both ends of the spectrum, if you will. I have another pop quiz here. Maybe someone can answer this question. Who was the first born-again president? Jimmy Carter. Correct answer. Sydney will give you a free book. Okay. Jimmy Carter was the first born-again president. He said it. It was not Ronald Reagan, but his politics and ideology clearly were not in keeping with evangelical DNA, so they anointed Ronald Reagan as their spiritual savior, or their political savior, I should say. And it's curious because Reagan never said that he was born again. And he had been divorced, and back in those days, if you had been divorced, evangelicals couldn't endorse you. My, how times have changed. He was just divorced, and he said, basically, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. And they did that despite the fact that Nancy had a spiritual advisor, Jean Houston, and by the way, she was into astrology. Don't tell anyone. But it began a long marriage between CBN to what I would say one party, one ideology, and I think it does bear watching today. We are seeing the merging of spirituality and politics as we've never seen it before. And it's important not to jump into that ourselves. I would not feel good if my Unity Church in Chesapeake, Virginia said that we need to promote or endorse this particular candidate. I would be offended at Unity or A.R.E. if they were passing out cards saying, here's how you should vote, some sort of political scorecard. Now, some people who have worked with CBN and some who are still working with CBN have had a change of heart. Terry Heaton is a producer, upper left-hand corner. He was a producer for many years, Charlie, right, at CBN. And he says he wants to apologize to a generation of Christians. He said that we were Fox News at CBN long before they were. Danuta Soderman, former co-host of the 700 Club, she was there for 5 years. Her history has been completely blanched from the CBN website, said, when I saw the current president running for office, he reminded me of Pat Robertson. And David Brody is the chief political correspondent for CBN, and he wrote or co-wrote a glowing spiritual biography of the current president. Now, I would only say this, and perhaps I'd get some agreement from Mr. Cayce. There's nothing wrong with being politically involved. We need to do that. But I think the marriage between any political or religious organization with a particular party or a particular ideology is a danger note. Today we have Mr. Robertson's former attorney for the American League of Civil Justice, Jay Sekulow, is now representing the president, and Pat himself has said that the Mueller investigation should be ended. And again, I'm not up here to get political today, but I think it's a chilling reminder of what can happen when religion and politics marry. Cayce addressed this. He was always saying, be careful with politics, be careful with isms, not merely as an idealist, but rather be right for a cause, prompted from a desire to be a channel through which blessings might come to your fellow man. For no while political affiliation is a service, the greatest among you will be the servant, will do the service to all. There is also carried with same a greater responsibility. I think words to live by. Well, have we learned anything today? Is anything stuck? Why are these two organizations located here in the same place? What can one entity learn from the other? You know, when I conducted some of those radio interviews, as I talked about earlier in my talk, then I would ask Greg Braden, I can remember some offhand, Mark Victor Hansen, Chopra, Carolyn Mace, they all had an opinion because I didn't know the answer. I just wanted to know what their opinion was. And here were some of their opinions. Why CBN and A.R.E. are in the same place. Sometimes opposites attract. They demonstrate their shadow side, their denied selves, one to the other. This is emblematic of the awakening of the American soul, the fundamental and the esoteric. You are seeing the evolution of spirituality right in front of your eyes, from the literal interpretation of sacred scripture to the symbolic metaphysical meaning to each and every soul. And if I had to sum it up in one word, and I know generalities are generally poor statements, but if I had to sum it up in one word, what CBN might be able to learn from A.R.E. would be to come in. To make that inner spiritual journey, the more contemplative, intuitive spiritual journey, a greater tolerance for diversity in religion, race, and sexual orientation. You know, only 56% of evangelicals today believe that their way is the only way to heaven. And you go back 15 years ago, and it was somewhere in the upper 80s, 90%, my way or the highway, that kind of thing. Those things are changing. I'm also hoping things such as the Gnostic Gospels will open up other Christians to the esoteric side behind this great story of Jesus. As far as the A.R.E. goes, if I had to use a word, what they could learn from CBN is to come out, to be strong in the message, and not just Cayce, but I would say most of the esoteric movements, whether it's unity or Unitarianism or religious science or any of those who feel that they're part of this great new thought branch of philosophy, is to come out, is to stand tall and be strong, not to wrestle with a pig in the mud, but to stand tall for what you believe in. You know, Charles Thomas told interesting stories when he was a young boy. He was kind of embarrassed. He didn't like to talk about it much. He talked about it right from the stage. And his dad told him, yeah, sometimes they think we're the spook house on the hill. But Hugh Lynn was a great example of how to stand strong and be proud of something that was outside the mainstream, that was a little ahead of history. You know, we sometimes feel so safe being in with lots of other people, there's safety in numbers. It really takes some courage to be out on the leading edge, to speak your truth, and yet to be civil and respectful of people you disagree with at the very same time. I'm also hoping that part of, again, loosely configured the New Age, New Thought movement will take a page out of the American Transcendentalists and the deists. And the American Transcendentalists, which Paul and I talk about this at Unity, she talks about this all the time, is really part of the DNA of the New Thought movement. And the American Transcendentalists were contemplative. They were deeply spiritual people, but they got involved. They got out there. They were at the head of the anti-slavery movement. They were at the head of the suffragette movement. They were at the head of the pro-environment movement. And let me just tell you a little story. You know, I was at CBN, you know, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, evangelicals were marginalized. Republicans didn't want to have anything to do with them. Eisenhower, Barry Goldwater thought they were nuts. Richard Nixon, not so much. Ronald Reagan, a different story. And why? When evangelicals felt marginalized in those earlier times, what did they do? They got on school boards. They got involved in city council. They ran for mayor. They were the proverbial dog catcher. They got involved in the civic and the civil process. That's something we can learn from these guys here too. Those early Masons and deists. Even the Quakers, people of the inner light, when it came to taking action, they knew exactly what to do. I hope that A.R.E. and others like them will utilize, let me move back here, we're out of order here, that happens sometimes. I hope that A.R.E. will begin to utilize its technology and its media to greater effect. We all want to see that Cayce movie out there, don't we? Love to see that 5-part series on HBO or PBS. And this word or two about Virginia Beach, I believe, and you'll have to wait for my Founding Mystics article to come out, but I really believe that Virginia is the heart chakra of the nation. There really is a reason that we say Virginia is for lovers. Cayce said that Washington, D.C. was not only the capital of our nation, but it was the capital of the world. And yes, Virginia Beach is the site of the first landing of those settlers. Not only that, but the Revolutionary War was won right outside these windows. I don't know if you folks are knowing. I'm pointing towards the beach, right? Yes, I am. Comte de Grasse, a French admiral, defeated the British who could not resupply Yorktown. War is over, America begins. It happened right here. And here in Virginia Beach, our seal is the sun, it's the cross, and this lighthouse right here, this is the very first lighthouse ever commissioned by the new United States in 1791. It's only a mile or so up the road. You know, I have to say something. I am so grateful that authors, such as one sitting here in the front row, are reclaiming the esoteric heritage of the United States. In some ways, the evangelicals have done a great job of co-opting and claiming Jesus, the Bible, patriotism, the founders. Heck, some even think that Jesus gave us the Constitution. I showed this at my Unity Church once, and I said, I can't comment on it because, quite frankly, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But I'm absolutely so happy and proud that Sidney's book is called An American Prophet. Now, Mitch Horowitz tells me a story that you were thinking about calling it The Messenger at first. Any truth to that? Yeah. There is, okay. Well, but you know what? And which would have been a great title, too. But what I love about this is stepping forward and taking pride and saying, Cayce is a true American. He represents the very highest ideals of the American spirit. Not only that, but America helped create Cayce. When you go back to that Hermetic lineage up through Europe and the Freemasonry and the Rosicrucian influences that helped birth the deistic movement and the Masonic movement here in this country, and later the American Transcendental Movement and spiritualism in the late 19th century, that created an ecosystem that an Edgar Cayce could come along in the late 19th century and give us the richness of these readings. That is an American story. And I also love this too, when Mitch Horowitz is here and talking about the occult America. That's right, say it loud, say it proud. Just tell it like it is. Well, let me end where I began. Let's go back to Frank and Marion. So their skepticism and disdain for my move to Virginia Beach lessened over a period of time. I started my own career. I actually went and practiced law for a little while. That probably made them happy. And then I actually was in-house counsel for a broadcasting company, and that's how I was able to segue into my television program and do some other things. But my dad didn't really quite understand the Cayce stuff. In fact, what's really interesting is this. Frank was one of the, if not the greatest experts with castor oil in the world. Now, it's used in has a lot of industrial uses. But apparently the A.R.E. had been purchasing some castor oil from their company. And my father knew I was here in Virginia Beach and was doing something with this Cayce guy or whatever. And somehow a bill of lading comes across his desk, and it's for 50 tins, 5-gallon tins of castor oil. And he looks at it and he goes, what the hell is my crazy son doing? Of course, I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. And it was only later in life that I said, no, Dad, castor oil was the palm of Christi, according to Cayce. It was the palm of Christ. And he was dying of cancer at that time. But it was a great way to kind of close the circle and talk about it. My mom just passed away weeks ago, and I have so much to be thankful for. She's made it to every Unity talk I've ever given. And I know she was proud of me. We had a great love and reverence for each other. But one of the things I did want to say as far as castor oil goes, I can tell you that I had plenty of experience early on because my brother and I did at least 1,000 projects on castor oil and castor beans growing up as kids. So I would like to think today that if Mom and Dad were still alive and it was, an updated version of what happened in 1983, my mom wouldn't have said, Frank, he's meditating. Don't worry, Marion, he's a lawyer. That today they might say, Frank, he's a lawyer. Don't worry, Marion. He's meditating. Thank you very much. I just want to make two really quick points. Thank you so much. I really want to make two quick points. You know, at our Unity Church, we're going to get involved in live streaming. And it's been my dream that we become involved in broadcasting. And one day, Paula, our minister, said, would you get up there and talk a little bit about your A.R.E. and CBN experience and tell them that, why we need to be doing this? Because Unity in some ways is that great bridge sometimes between the esoteric and the more straightforward traditional Christianity. And I got up there and I started speaking. And I really felt passionate about it. And I look out in the audience and who do I see? Kevin Tedeschi, Executive Director of the A.R.E. Seated next to him, unbeknownst to him, is Charlie Tudor. Charlie Tudor was Pat Robertson's first videographer. So they are sitting next to each other, and there are plenty of seats around, guys. They're sitting right next to each other in a small church, unbeknownst to each other, and I'm thinking, that's a great collective mind speaking. That's a great esoteric synchronicity in flesh. And I'll just finish up with this one last quote, and it's from the Course in Miracles. I think it's pertinent today. The holiest spot on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love. We can go ahead and I think we actually have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, we can follow up with that. Gary, if you'd like to just go ahead, and I think a gal is over here.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
Before you showed the slide, Virginia is for lovers.
Yes.
I was thinking that this is the solar plexus. Because if you think about it, that is around the navel, at the birth center, and it is the most powerful. This is where you get in touch with your power, and so the connection with the sun, and so anyway.
And you might be right in some ways. It's funny. I talked about this, and one day I'll write about it if Sydney lets me publish it in Venture Inward. But I really do believe that there's a chakra center for the 13 original colonies. I think the heart is up in Washington, D.C. I think the third chakra is somewhere around Virginia Beach. You might be right about that.
Thank you.
I'm going to keep that in mind. I might borrow it. We've got one back here, and we have another gal right here.
I would like to add that I think it may be the third eye.
Okay.
I don't have a question for you. I just wanted to know, to tell you that I'm really proud to sit in the audience and listen to you talk, because I helped support you back in the 70s with a tin of that castor oil.
Thank you, Frank.
I thank you so much for talking about polarities. It reminds me of Harmon Bro, and I also wonder what made these CBN people transform. If you know anything in their biographies, or
what means did you say would they transform? I missed
what
that.
Made? Is there any true point in their life that made them change to a more inner search, a spiritual search?
In other words, you feel like what could make them make this more esoteric, inner spiritual journey?
Yeah. How to convince people?
Well, it's not even about convincing. I tell you what the answer is. Someone said this recently. I thought that you don't win arguments. You win hearts and minds by storytelling. That's why the stories that Sydney tells, you tell stories of human people, and the Christian tradition has a great mystical tradition. I have Catholic brother and sister, and I'll ask them, what do you think about Meister Eckhart or Thomas Merton or Hildegard von Bingen? And they go, what, who, what? And it's the kind of thing where, well, actually they do know Thomas Merton now, but there is a contemplative side of Christianity. But again, like the Jesus movement in the 60s kind of got it subsumed by this Great Awakening, this third Great Awakening, which has some merit to it, has some passion, but sometimes it's more about the noise and the passion as opposed to the contemplation. I think as human beings, we kind of need both, right?
Thank you.
Right here.
Someone said that
Well, you know, I mean, the thing is, so many of our founding fathers were Masons. So whether you're looking at Madison, Monroe, Washington, Jefferson, they all had ties to Freemasonry. And I know Masonry, you know, evolved or devolved into other things over a period of time. But at its very core, I mean, just look at that symbol itself, a pyramid with an eye at the top of the pyramid. I mean, people say, well, I don't know if the founding fathers were spiritual. I'd say, look at the dang symbol. And what does that say? You don't have to believe in pyramids. I mean, you know, many sides up the mountaintop to the top. The third eye, I mean, literally, physically, and also esoterically. The third eye is the great mystical eye where all great religions come together, where every great religion has a mystical tradition. So as far as starting here, I know that there are enclaves here. You can go up to Williamsburg. There are plenty of them here. But yeah, Freemasonry, deism, Unitarianism, big part of U.S.'s DNA. In fact, Valerie and I were thinking we should make a hat saying, make deism great again. Good idea? Do it.
I'd ask for a comment about the people who were already here.
I'll get to you in a second. Sorry.
I'd like to have you comment on the people who were already here whenever we had the influx of Europeans into this country,
Yeah,
and their
absolutely.
history and their status today. Thank you.
You know, thank you. I mean, years ago, the first pilot, I did a pilot here back in 1999 at WHRO, which aired on PBS, and it was called The American Spiritual Vision. And I had Mark Victor Hansen, Carolyn Mace, Corrine McLaughlin, and also a lawyer from CBN. We all sat down and had a live conversation. It was a pilot that almost got, one of those near misses that pilots almost get picked up but they don't. But in that documentary, or in the documentary portion of that conversation, we said that America will never really meet its spiritual destiny until we take the mindset of Western European both spirituality and consciousness and merge that with the indigenous consciousness of the Native Americans who are here. Now, I always caution people that, you know, our Native American culture, while having a rich spiritual heritage, also has their history of wars as well. Have you ever gone to, the first time I went to Hawaii, I was like, wow, you know, Caucasians and then the Europeans really plundered this place, until I realized that they were fighting among themselves as well. So the point being is, I think every tradition, Native American for sure, and the esoteric tradition that came here from Europe. I mean, look at Quakers. A lot of Quakers did not want to even pick up a gun. Look at Sydney's talk yesterday that discussed, you know, the man who's the artist. Can I forget his name? But he was a Quaker. He did not carry a gun. The Quakers believed in the inner light. They believed in contemplation. Of course, they were also at the head of the whaling industry in Nantucket, but that's another story for another time.
Well, first of all, that's interesting. Thank you for saying that.
Sure.
My DNA vibrates African, European, and Native American, so it flows all through me. So it's still
Yes.
fighting. The war still goes on.
Yes.
So what is your next steps? What are your next storytelling steps? Are you going to be a part of that 5-part series that we're going to see on HBO about Edgar Cayce?
We don't, you know, I tell you the truth, I'm really right now at the disposal of spirit, whatever he, she, it wants to do. We have a program right now that's been, our legal television show has been picked up by 200 PBS stations, which is supposed to start this fall. And, you know, we talk about constitutional issues, and, you know, there's nothing more important, I think, in our nation right at this time. But, you know, look, if we're called to do something else. And thank you also for bringing up the African-American tradition, too. I mean, part of the great liberal spiritual tradition is what Martin Luther King did. And of course, Martin Luther King managed, much like the Transcendentalist, was a man of God, didn't try to wrestle in the mud with people who would put him down or try to kill him or whatever else. He kept it on the highest vibratory level as well, spoke his truth, got right to the head of the line no matter what it took. I also think it's kind of interesting, maybe just a coincidence, that Mr. Cayce was there in Selma. One of Martin Luther King's greatest moments was in Selma, Alabama. Fire away.
Hi, they're going to make a recording of this program. Is there a way that this could be at a link that we could share with our friends and people that
Kevin
need to
Grant
learn
will let
about
us
this?
know that. I think this is going to be on the website, on A.R.E.'s website at some point in time. I'm almost certain of that. Right, Kevin? I can't see Kevin. He's behind me. Kevin's behind the bank of monitors. He just gave me the thumbs up. So at some point in time, this will be. I think they do 3 or 4 camera shoot here, so it's recorded somewhere, somehow, some way. Gentleman in the first row.
Yes, my name is Larry Van Hoos, and looking at this controversy, we're on the same side as CBN. Let's not forget that. We stand for the same values. When I was a student at Atlantic University, a bunch of us used to go out to CBN Library because they stayed open till midnight. A.R.E. shut down at 8. Mm-hmm. Every paper I ever wrote out there, I always got an A on here.
It was the vibe. It was the vibe.
Well, there's a lot of magnifying the areas of agreement.
Yeah.
We need to start by hanging an American flag out here on the flagpole. There's nothing there and nothing in here. We could start by reclaiming the American heritage and the home of Edgar Cayce. He would not have chosen to have been here had we not have our hard-won American freedoms, which I think a lot of us share.
Absolutely.
The same sentiments that you see out. Go out to CBN one time. I'm talking about people here. Don't go out there with this holier-than-thou attitude, because believe me, there's a lot of holy people out there too who come here, and they're both. Real quick, and I'll end it. I used to do a lot of work for them. They tell me I'm a pretty good actor. They always cast me as a saint. in their morality plays that they would broadcast. So I've been St. John, I've been a wise man and all this and that. But somehow I think they got hold of my
resume.
My resume. Yes, they did. And so I don't get.
You know who Chris Van Cleve is?
Oh, I know Chris very well.
All right. Well, Chris was in a movie. He played Jesus. Guess what happened? When they found out who he was, they kicked him out.
Well,
so here's the thing, and I would agree with you 100%. I loved a lot of people at CBN.
Absolutely.
Loved them. Had a great relationship with them. To this day, I would tell them I love them. Right? Charlie's from CBN. He was right behind this gentleman. So I mean, and I hope we're playing a little bit and having a little fun today too. But I hope, as far as a holier-than-thou attitude, I can tell you this: that the moment we step into that, we're losing.
Absolutely.
So we play a little bit of fun here, but the thing is this: if there is a way to create common ground, because honestly, I think a lot of people are thirsting there for a deeper relationship with Jesus and what he really stood for. And so over the years, having been exposed to some of these things, and I wouldn't even go into all the stories that have cropped up, is that, the Cayce story of Jesus is a genial one. And an interesting one. It doesn't even matter whether they follow that or not. It's funny, even watching Bill Maher, who's an atheist, on a Friday night on HBO, he agrees with Jesus' teachings in the Beatitudes. I mean, it's not for just Christians. It's not for esoteric New Agers, New Thoughters. It's not for atheists. I mean, we all can learn something from Jesus and to walk that path. And I did enjoy my time there. And I had a lot of good friends. And only one person defriended me once I told them I was involved with A.R.E. That's not too bad. Back in the day.
I've never had that experience overtly anyway. But
in the 1980s they did, but maybe not today.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. They are evolving just the same way that we are evolving, the same way that all of humanity is evolving. And let's recognize that. I once answered an ad that their Department of Theology had out there. They were looking for an expert in Buddhism. To become a teacher in their seminary. They wanted to have some comparative religion. I didn't get the job, but I didn't try that hard. However, I did get a copy of my book onto the desk of their head honcho, who is he's a Pentecostal. Dr. Asian, Dr. Wong, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it's all coming in there, and I've said too much already. So
no, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Excellent point. I want to see more panels, like Wesleyan has a lot of panels. They have interreligious panels. I'd love to see a CBN person talk next to an A.R.E. person. We don't want to create the drama that happened 2,000 years ago, okay? I mean, there's no need to go through that again. We're all welcoming the notion of the Christ within us. Any other questions?
I want to say one thing.
Yes.
I was very much benefited by the evangelical movement.
Mm-hmm.
I chose that as a teenager because that was the only source I had to find Christ. And then they became dogmatic. And I was a missionary with these evangelicals, and now I look back on them and I think, oh, they were so narrow. With Edgar Cayce, there's freedom, no dogmas. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Wonderful.
Sydney had something to say. Did Sydney go already? Did you have something to say, Sydney?
It was just a little footnote saying that, after we
No. Sydney's got all the great stories. He's just shared some with us, too. Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it.
Sorry.
Now we know why he won 5 enemies.